The most fundamental instinct of any biological organism is the desperate drive to survive. No human being is born willingly prepared to die for a distant, silent empire. So how does the Imperium of man turn billions of ordinary, terrified people into disposable soldiers? How do you convince a human being to march willingly into the jaws of a cosmic meat grinder? Today, we do not examine the mechanics of a weapon, but the systematic destruction of a soul. We explore the profound psychological horror of the Imperial Guard and discover how a human mind learns to completely stop valuing its own life. The most fundamental, undeniable instinct of any biological organism is the desperate drive to survive. A human being is born with an inherent burning desire to protect their own life, to seek comfort, and to avoid suffering. To build an army, a civilization must normally convince its citizens that their individual sacrifice will protect their homes, their families, or their personal freedoms. But the Imperium of man does not have the time, the resources, nor the inclination to convince billions of people to willingly die for a distant god. Instead, it has perfected a psychological manufacturing process. The Astra Militarum is not a military organization in the traditional historical sense. It is a monolithic, galactic-scale meat grinder, an industrial complex where the primary raw material is human flesh. When a planetary governor is ordered to pay their tithe, they do not simply send willing recruits, they export human tonnage. The staggering casualty rates of the Imperial Guard are not an accident, nor are they a failure of tactical planning. The machine operates exactly as designed, relying heavily on the terrifying absolute abundance of human life to mathematically overwhelm the horrors of the galaxy. To feed this endless machine, the Imperium cannot rely on patriots or heroes. It must manufacture compliant tools. The psychological conditioning of an Imperial Guardsman begins with the violent, systematic erasure of their individual identity. The exact moment a conscript is herded into the cold steel belly of a Departamento Militarum transport ship, they cease to be a person with a history, a family, or a future. Their given name, the very foundation of their human ego, is violently stripped away and permanently replaced by a coldly assigned alphanumeric designation. This psychological destruction is deeply reinforced by their physical environment. The conscript is stripped of all personal possessions, ensuring that every tiny physical anchor to their past life is permanently incinerated. They are issued a standard uniform, meticulously designed to be utterly identical to the billions of other uniforms currently rotting in trenches across the stars. When the conscript looks to their left or their right, they do not see unique individuals. They see an infinite, repeating mirror of their own faceless anonymity. They are taught, visually and physically, that they are completely interchangeable. The brutal training regimen of the Imperial Guard is rarely about creating elite, free-thinking tactical operators. It is a carefully calibrated process of psychological subjugation designed to permanently break the individual will. The recruits are subjected to agonizing physical exhaustion, sensory deprivation, and the constant screaming threats of the commissariat. The ultimate goal is to entirely dismantle the concept of the self. A soldier who values their own thoughts, their own comfort, or their own survival is a soldier who might hesitate on the firing line. And hesitation is a mathematical inefficiency the Imperium cannot tolerate. The final, crushing realization that cements this initial stage of psychological industrialization is the economic reality of their own equipment. As the shivering conscript is handed their standard-issue lasgun, they are taught a terrifying, absolute truth. The weapon in their hands required centuries of preserved technological knowledge to manufacture, whereas the human holding it was produced by simple biological accident in a crowded hive city. The guardsman internalizes the absolute, undeniable fact that the mass-produced rifle they carry is fundamentally, objectively, and economically far more valuable to the Imperium than their own beating heart. Once the individual identity is erased, the Imperium begins the second phase of its psychological harvest, the total desensitization to horror. In a natural human environment, the sight of a single corpse is a traumatic, life-altering event that haunts the mind for years. But for a guardsman, the landscape of death is the only reality they are permitted to know. They are deliberately submerged in an ocean of gore, surrounded by the stench of scorched ozone and rotting meat, until the biological mind is forced to perform a brutal act of self-defense. The human brain is a fragile organ, unequipped to process the industrial-scale slaughter of the 41st millennium. To survive the constant barrage of visceral terror, the mind begins to build a thick, emotional scar tissue. The initial screams of a dying comrade, which once caused the soldier's heart to seize with panic, slowly transform into nothing more than background noise, no different from the rhythmic thumping of distant artillery. The horror does not go away. It simply becomes boring. This normalization of attrition is the Imperium's most effective psychological tool. When a guardsman sees their squad shattered for the 10th time in a single campaign, the shock of loss is replaced by a cold, hollow apathy. They no longer mourn the names of the fallen because they have long since stopped learning the names of the living. To care about a comrade is to invite a devastating psychological burden that the soldier can no longer afford to carry. Empathy is a luxury that is violently discarded in the mud of the trench. As the war drags on, the guardsman enters a state of psychological paralysis. They watch the most unspeakable atrocities, the Xenos monsters tearing men apart, the warp fire melting bone, and they feel absolutely nothing. The amygdala, the part of the brain that processes fear, is effectively burnt out by constant overstimulation. They are no longer fighting for glory or even for survival. They are merely going through the motions of a machine that has forgotten how to stop. The death of empathy leads to the death of the self-preservation instinct. If the lives of those around you have zero value, it becomes logically impossible to maintain the belief that your own life has any worth. The soldier begins to view themselves through the same cold, detached lens they use to view the mountains of corpses they climb over every day. They are surrounded by billions of dead men who were once just like them, and the brain finally accepts the inevitable conclusion: death is not an anomaly, it is the standard operating procedure. By the time a guardsman has survived a month on the front lines, they are effectively a living ghost. They move, they fire their weapon, and they obey orders. But the vibrant, feeling human being who left their homeworld has been permanently extinguished. The Imperium does not need soldiers who are brave. It needs soldiers who are so emotionally hollow that the prospect of their own annihilation no longer registers as a threat. They have been successfully desensitized to their own ending. The third phase of the soldier's transformation is the internalization of learned worthlessness. This is not a passive byproduct of war, but a deliberate theological indoctrination provided by the Ministorum. From the moment they can speak, Imperial citizens are taught that their existence is a debt they can never fully repay to the God Emperor. They are told that they are small, sinful, and entirely insignificant. The Astra Militarum simply takes this lifelong feeling of inadequacy and weaponizes it into a military doctrine. The propaganda machines of the Imperium do not promise a long life or a peaceful retirement. They promise only the opportunity for a meaningful death. A guardsman is constantly reminded that their only value to the species is their utility in the meat grinder. They are compared to the bolts in a tank or the fuel in a Prometheum tank, vital for the machine's function, but entirely disposable once their purpose is served. This message is repeated until it becomes the soldier's only truth. As this indoctrination takes root, the guardsmen stop seeing themselves as a human being with a personal purpose. They begin to see themselves as a resource, a data point on a logistics spreadsheet maintained by a faceless clerk light years away. They realize that the administratum has already calculated their life expectancy down to the second, and that their death has already been budgeted for before they even landed on the planet. To believe your life has intrinsic value in such a system is a form of delusional arrogance. The erosion of personal purpose is replaced by a singular, suffocating sense of duty. The soldier is taught that their soul belongs to the emperor and their body belongs to the Departamento Munitorum. They are stripped of the right to own their own mortality. If they die in the service of an objective, they are a successful resource. If they survive at the cost of a failed objective, they are a defective one. The individual's only path to perfection is to be consumed by the machine. This theological pressure creates a soldier who fears failure far more than they fear death. The commissar standing behind the line is not just there to punish cowards. He is the physical manifestation of the Imperium's judgment. To die for the Emperor is a blessing. To die for oneself through cowardice is an eternal sin. The soldier is trapped between two forms of annihilation, and they eventually learn to choose the one that offers a shred of artificial meaning. In the end, learned worthlessness is the ultimate psychological cage. It convinces the guardsmen that the best thing they can possibly do with their life is to lose it as efficiently as possible. They stop fighting to live and begin fighting to ensure their death isn't a waste of the Imperium's investment. They have finally reached the point where they view their own heartbeat as an unnecessary expense that they are eager to settle. When the human mind is pushed past the absolute limit of terror and desensitization, it faces a profound crisis. It cannot survive in a state of pure, unadulterated nihilism. If life is a terrifying, painful slog toward an inevitable, unrecorded death, the brain will desperately try to invent a reason for the suffering. This is the psychological tipping point where the guardsman begins to actively construct their own mental prison. They must find meaning in the meat grinder, or they will completely shatter. The Imperium masterfully exploits this psychological vulnerability. It offers the broken soldier a single glittering lie in the darkness, the concept of holy sacrifice. The guardsman is allowed to believe that while their life is utterly worthless, their death can be profoundly meaningful. They are taught that every drop of blood spilled on the mud is a direct, personal offering to the God Emperor on Terra. The misery is no longer random. It is violently repurposed into a sacred currency. This creates a terrifying shift in the soldiers' internal motivation. They are no longer fighting for the abstract idea of survival because they have already accepted that they are a walking corpse. Instead, they begin to fight for the aesthetic quality of their own demise. The guardsman begins to think, if I must die in this muddy trench, let it be a death that buys the regiment another hour. They exchange the desire to live for the desperate hope that their ending will serve a specific, quantifiable utility. This search for meaning is not an act of heroism, it is an act of sheer psychological desperation. The human mind simply cannot tolerate the idea that its suffering is entirely pointless. By attaching a grand, cosmic significance to their agonizing existence, the soldier creates a mental shield against the suffocating madness of the battlefield. It is the only way to rationalize the sight of their friends being torn apart by artillery. The sacrifice must matter. because the alternative is to admit that the universe is just a cold, meaningless slaughterhouse. Consequently, the Imperial Guard becomes an army fueled entirely by manufactured martyrdom. The soldiers do not charge the enemy lines out of a brave, defiant love for their civilization. They charge because the forward momentum is the only direction that offers any semblance of purpose. To retreat is to render all previous suffering completely void, and to face the agonizing reality of their own disposability. They march forward to validate the horror they have already endured. In this twisted framework, death is no longer a failure of the biological instinct to survive. Death becomes the ultimate finalized objective. The Guardsman learns to view their own destruction not as a tragedy, but as the successful completion of a transaction. They have finally paid their tithe to the God Emperor, purchasing a tiny fraction of a second for an empire that will immediately forget their designation. The mind has successfully adapted to the abyss by falling in love with the fall. This brings us to the profound philosophical twist at the absolute core of the Astra Militarum. When an Imperial observer watches a wave of millions of guardsmen charge headlong into the teeth of a tyrannid swarm, they often mistake this action for unfathomable courage. The propagandists paint beautiful murals of heroic humans bravely facing down the nightmares of the dark out of a deep, abiding love for the Imperium. But this is the ultimate magnificent lie of the 41st millennium. The truth is far darker and far more elegant. The Imperium of man does not need its soldiers to be brave, and it certainly does not need them to love their own lives. True courage requires a baseline understanding that your life possesses inherent value, and that you are choosing to risk that valuable asset for a higher cause. But the Guardsman has already been systematically stripped of that value. They are not risking anything because they no longer believe they have anything left to lose. The Guardsman does not stop fearing death because they have conquered their fear. They stop fearing death because their life has been rendered completely intolerable. When existence is defined by endless freezing mud, rotting rations, the deafening roar of artillery, and the constant screaming abuse of the commissariat, the concept of dying loses its terrifying edge. Death ceases to be the worst possible outcome. In many cases, it becomes the only mathematically guaranteed form of rest. The true genius of the Imperial war machine is that it does not demand bravery, it only demands obedience. The system is meticulously designed so that the terror of disobedience vastly outweighs the terror of the enemy. The Commissar's bolt pistol is not just a tool of discipline, it is a psychological anchor. The soldier looks forward and sees the horrifying jaws of an alien beast, but they look backward and see the cold, absolute certainty of Imperial execution, eternal damnation, and the shame of a wasted life. They choose to run toward the alien beast not out of heroism, but out of a cold, calculated despair. It is simply the path of least spiritual resistance. The Imperium has successfully engineered an environment where dying in battle is the least agonizing option available to a human being. It is a system built not on the strength of the human spirit, but on the systematic, industrial exploitation of its total collapse. The soldier is an empty vessel, entirely drained of hope, filled only with the mechanical necessity to obey. Therefore, the most defining characteristic of the Imperial Guard is not their overwhelming numbers or their heavy artillery. It is their profound, manufactured emptiness. They are the perfect weapons for a dying galaxy because they have already internalized the death of their own souls. The universe throws its most unspeakable horrors at the Imperium, and the Imperium responds by throwing billions of people who have already been taught that their lives are entirely worthless. It is the victory of absolute weaponized nihilism. The transmission of this psychological assessment is complete. In the end, the Imperium's greatest weapon is not the mass-produced lasgun, the heavily armored battle tank, or the orbital bombardments. It is the human mind's terrifying, tragic ability to adapt to absolute hopelessness. The meat grinder turns because the flesh has been trained to welcome the blade. As an authorized observer of this archival data, your psychological compliance is mandatory. The administratum requires proof of your attention to this doctrinal broadcast. Strike the like button to register your biometric signature on the casualty ledger. It is the only metric that proves you were present before the algorithm purges the record. If you wish to remain tethered to this specific frequency and continue your study of the galaxy's darkest truths, submit your permanent conscription form by subscribing to W40k. Your life is the Emperor's currency. Spend it well. The channel will broadcast again soon.